My name is Mara Monroe. I'm 33, and I spent 11 years as a flight attendant saving every spare dollar before I ever signed a single document with someone else's name on it. Sunday dinner at Glenda Monroe's house always started the same way. Pot roast, the good china, a tablecloth ironed so precisely it looked like it had never once been used. The dining room smelled like rosemary and the specific, cloying sweetness of the lavender hand cream Glenda kept by every sink in her house. A scent that had started, over the last 3 months, to follow me home in ways I hadn't fully registered until it became impossible to ignore. I sat at my usual seat, across from my husband Wade, beside his sister Tessa, who'd spent the first 20 minutes of dinner describing a vacation she clearly couldn't afford, in the same breath she'd used to ask Glenda for a small loan, just until things settled down. Things were always about to settle down with Tessa. They never quite did. I'd flown a transatlantic route the night before, the kind of shift that leaves your whole body running 4 hours behind the room you're sitting in, and I remember feeling that particular suspended exhaustion settle over me as Glenda set down her fork with deliberate precision and reached for a folded piece of paper tucked beside her plate. "I think it's time we discussed something," she said, sliding the paper across the table toward me with the same unhurried confidence she uses to rearrange furniture in a house she doesn't own. I unfolded it. Handwritten, in Glenda's careful cursive, an itemized monthly bill. Utilities, shared maintenance, and at the bottom, underlined twice. Rent, $1,000 per month. Due the first of each month, beginning immediately. I am, professionally, a risk analyst. I spend my days reading documents that other people hope nobody will read carefully, finding the exact place where a number doesn't match the story attached to it. I read that handwritten bill exactly the way I read any flagged transaction at work, slowly, completely, without letting my expression change until I'd fully understood what I was looking at. "Rent for what exactly?" I said. "For the apartment," Glenda said, as though the answer were self-evident. "Family properties should contribute to family expenses. We've all agreed it's only fair." I looked at Wade. He didn't meet my eyes. He looked instead at his plate, at the pot roast he'd barely touched, the same particular stillness he deploys whenever his mother says something he privately disagrees with, but has never once, in 4 years of marriage, found the nerve to contradict out loud. If you've ever watched the person who's supposed to be on your side go quiet at exactly the moment you needed him loudest, drop a comment. I think that particular silence cuts deeper than almost anything anyone could actually say. I bought that apartment 4 years before I ever met Wade. 11 years of saved layover per diems, overtime, shifts nobody else wanted, a decade of careful, unglamorous discipline that turned into a $72,000 down payment and a mortgage I paid down faster than any financial advisor ever expected me to. Every receipt, every closing document, every monthly statement sat in a filing cabinet in my own home office, organized by date, because I have never once in my life trusted a verbal agreement to hold the same weight as paper. 3 weeks into our marriage, Wade had asked me to sign what he called simple estate planning documents, the kind of routine paperwork married couples sign without much thought, protecting each other in case anything ever happened. I'd signed without reading every page as closely as I should have, the only time in my entire adult life I'd let trust override my own training, the one exception to 11 years of careful documentation habits made for a husband I genuinely believed wouldn't need a closer read. I didn't know yet, sitting at that dinner table on day 93 of our marriage, exactly what those papers had actually done. I just knew, looking at a handwritten rent bill for an apartment that had my name on the original deed and nobody else's, that something didn't add up, and I have spent my entire career being the person in the room who refuses to let a number sit unexplained. "I'll think about it," I said, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into my bag instead of arguing. Glenda smiled, satisfied, already reaching for the gravy boat, certain the matter had been settled exactly the way she'd intended it to be. She had no idea I'd already started running the numbers. I didn't say anything to Wade on the drive home from his mother's house. He talked about something at work, the specific kind of filler conversation people use to avoid acknowledging that something uncomfortable just happened. And I let him fill the silence because I needed the quiet inside my own head to start the work I already knew I'd be doing that night. The streetlights passed overhead in their familiar rhythm, the same route I'd driven 100 times before, and I remember staring out the passenger window, thinking less about the rent demand itself, and more about the specific, casual confidence with which Glenda had delivered it. The confidence of someone who'd never once expected to be questioned. The smell of Glenda's lavender hand cream clung faintly to my cardigan, the same way it had been clinging to my apartment for the last 3 months, ever since Wade had given her a key without asking me first. I'd noticed the smell creeping into my own closet, my own bathroom, small evidence of a woman who'd apparently decided family property entitled her to come and go as she pleased, rearranging throw pillows, opening mail addressed only to me, leaving behind the specific, cloying residue of someone who believed ownership worked differently for her than it worked for everyone else. I'd mentioned it to Wade once, casually, asking if he knew why his mother's hand lotion kept showing up on my bathroom counter. He'd laughed it off, said she probably just liked to freshen things up when she stopped by, and I'd let the explanation slide, because confronting it directly had seemed, at the time, smaller than it actually was. I waited until Wade had fallen asleep that night before I opened my laptop at the kitchen island, the same island where I'd once spread out closing documents 4 years earlier, reviewing every line before I signed anything with my own money on the line. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling, the specific late-night quiet that's always made it easiest for me to think clearly. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't really want, more out of habit than thirst. The same ritual I use at work, before opening a file I suspect is going to take longer than the rest of my evening was supposed to allow for. I started with the county recorder's office website, searching my own property records the way I'd search any flagged account at work, methodically, without assuming I already knew what I'd find. The interface was the same clunky government portal I'd used 4 years earlier to confirm my own closing had recorded properly, and I felt a strange, distant familiarity navigating it again, this time for a reason I hadn't anticipated needing. The original deed came up first, exactly as I remembered it. Mara Monroe, sole owner, recorded 4 years ago, the same document I'd framed a small copy of and kept in my home office as a private reminder of 11 years of saved per diems, finally turning into something permanent. I'd hung that frame the week I moved in, a small, private celebration nobody else had ever really understood the weight of. Not Wade, not my own parents, who'd never quite grasped how many overnight layovers and skipped vacations it had taken to get there. Beneath it, a second filing. Recorded 3 weeks after our wedding. A quitclaim deed, my signature on it, the same signature I recognized from a stack of estate planning documents. Wade had asked me to sign during a week I'd been working 4 consecutive overnight shifts and trusting my husband more than I'd trusted my own training to read every page closely. I remembered that exact evening now with painful clarity. Exhausted, jet-lagged, signing where he'd flagged with small yellow tabs, trusting the tabs more than I should have trusted anything without reading the surrounding language myself. The quitclaim added Wade Monroe as joint owner. I sat with that for a long moment, the blue light of the laptop, the only light in the kitchen, feeling something settle into place that wasn't quite anger yet, closer to the specific, cold clarity I get at work when a transaction I'd assumed was routine turns out to be the first thread in something much larger. If you've ever discovered that a document you signed without reading closely had quietly changed the entire shape of what you owned, drop a comment. I think that particular violation, the one that happens through paperwork instead of confrontation, is harder to explain to people who haven't lived through it. I kept digging. A home equity line of credit opened 19 days after the quitclaim was recorded against my apartment, using the joint ownership Wade and I apparently now shared. $68,000 drawn against equity. I'd spent over a decade building one saved paycheck at a time. I stared at that figure for a long moment, doing the same mental conversion I do automatically at work whenever a number needs context. That was roughly 9 months of my salary, 11 years of overnight shifts, and missed holidays compressed into a withdrawal I'd never once authorized or even been told about. I traced the disbursements the way I trace any suspicious transaction at work, date by date, recipient by recipient, refusing to let myself draw a conclusion until the documentation actually supported it. 4 payments to a credit card company I didn't recognize, totaling $31,000. I cross-referenced the account number against Wade's name through a public lien search and found it registered to him alone, a credit card I hadn't known existed throughout our entire relationship. The balance apparently large enough that paying it off had required nearly half of everything drawn against my equity. 3 wire transfers to an account I eventually traced after another hour of careful searching to Glenda's mortgage servicer. Payments that, cross-referenced against public foreclosure filings I found in the same county record search, had arrived exactly in time to halt a foreclosure process that had quietly begun against her house 6 months earlier. I read the foreclosure notice twice, checking the date against the wire transfers, watching the timeline align with an exactness that left no real room for coincidence. My own equity, my own apartment, used to pay off my husband's hidden credit card debt and rescue his mother's house from foreclosure. All of it arranged through paperwork I'd signed, believing it was routine. All of it happening without a single word said to me directly. I want to be careful here, because I think people expect this part of the story to arrive with screaming, with broken dishes, with some dramatic confrontation in the middle of the night. That isn't what happened. I sat at that kitchen island until almost 3 a.m, building a spreadsheet. The same way I build any risk assessment at work. Dates, amounts, sources, recipients, every figure cross-referenced against public records until the picture was complete enough that no amount of explanation could later soften it. The rent demand, I understood now, hadn't actually been about rent at all. It had been a test, a way to discover gently whether I'd simply accept reduced control over an asset that had quietly stopped being entirely mine, without ever once questioning how or when that had happened. If I'd paid that $1,000 without comment, I think Glenda would have considered the apartment fully absorbed into family property from that point forward, the same way she'd absorbed my closet space and my mail and my kitchen drawers over the preceding months. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake beside Wade, listening to his slow, untroubled breathing, and thought about every small surrender I'd made over 93 days of marriage, the key given without asking me. The rearranged furniture I'd assumed was simply Glenda being Glenda, the gradual, almost imperceptible absorption of an apartment I'd worked 11 years to afford into a story that wasn't mine. I am, by training and temperament, someone who doesn't act until I understand the entire shape of a problem. I spent the following 2 weeks building that understanding methodically, the same discipline that's kept me good at my job for a decade, gathering documents, requesting copies of every transaction, building a timeline so complete that nobody, later, would be able to argue with a single line of it. I hired Karen Esposito, a property attorney with a reputation for handling exactly this kind of quiet financial entanglement, the kind built not through dramatic theft, but through 1,000 small administrative decisions nobody quite noticed happening in real time. I sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon, my laptop open, My spreadsheet exported into a clean, organized presentation and watched her face as she went through it, page by page. Her office smelled like old paper and the specific bitterness of coffee left too long on a warmer. And she didn't say much while reading, just the occasional small intake of breath that told me, even before she spoke, exactly how clearly the documentation was speaking for itself. "This is clean," she said, after almost 40 minutes of silent reading. "Cleaner than most fraud cases I see. You've already done most of my job for me." "I've spent 11 years reading documents for a living," I said. I wasn't about to stop now, just because the document had my husband's name on it. She set the folder down and looked at me for a long moment. The particular professional assessment of someone deciding how direct she could afford to be with a new client. "Most people in your position come to me angry, wanting to burn everything down immediately. You came in with a spreadsheet." "The spreadsheet is how I get to burn it down correctly," I said. "If you've ever had to use the exact skill set from your career to investigate the people closest to you, drop a comment." I think there's a strange, specific loneliness in that. The realization that the training meant to protect you professionally is now the only thing protecting you personally, too. Karen helped me file the paperwork to legally block any further borrowing against the apartment. A quiet, procedural safeguard that required no confrontation, no announcement, simply a filing that would sit in county records the same way the original quitclaim had, waiting for anyone who eventually thought to check. I remember signing that filing in her office, feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't quite relief yet, more like the first solid foothold after realizing how far I'd actually fallen without noticing. I didn't confront Wade. Not yet. I didn't confront Glenda either, even as her Sunday dinner reminders about the first of the month kept arriving with increasing, casual confidence, each one a small, additional piece of evidence that the test had been real and that she fully expected me to fail it quietly. I simply kept building the folder the same way I build any case at work, patiently, completely, until the evidence itself would be the only thing required to do the talking. By the time the next family meeting was scheduled, I had spent 6 weeks building something far more thorough than Glenda or Wade had any reason to expect from a woman who'd simply folded a handwritten bill and tucked it quietly into her bag. The folder sat on my home office desk, navy blue, unremarkable, the kind of plain binder you could walk past 100 times without registering it as anything more than office supplies. Inside it, every document I'd pulled over those 6 weeks sat organized chronologically, tabbed, cross-referenced. The original deed, the quitclaim, the home equity disbursements, the foreclosure filing against Glenda's house, the credit card statements I'd eventually subpoenaed through Karen's office once it became clear Wade's hidden debt had a name and a balance that didn't match anything he'd ever told me about his finances. I want to explain what those 6 weeks actually felt like, because I think people imagine this part of a story moving faster than it does. It didn't move fast. It moved the way every careful audit moves, slow, methodical, occasionally maddening in its attention to small administrative details that felt, in the moment, disproportionately tedious given the size of what they eventually added up to. I kept living in the apartment that whole time. I kept attending Sunday dinners, kept eating Glenda's pot roast, kept listening to Tessa describe vacations and renovations she couldn't afford, while quietly cross-referencing, in my own head, which of those expenses might trace back to money that had once been mine. I didn't let my face change. I have spent 11 years learning to maintain a calm, professional expression while internally running calculations that would alarm anyone who could actually see them, and that particular skill turned out to be exactly as useful at a family dinner table as it had ever been in a boardroom. If you've ever had to sit across a table from someone, smiling, while quietly documenting exactly how they'd wronged you. Drop a comment. I think there's a specific, exhausting discipline to staying pleasant while building a case nobody else in the room knows exists yet. Wade noticed something had shifted eventually, though he never quite identified what. He started asking, with increasing frequency, whether I was okay, whether something at work was bothering me, the kind of vague concern people offer when they sense a change in temperature without understanding its source. I told him I was fine. I wasn't lying exactly. I was, by then, calmer than I'd been in months, the specific calm that arrives once a problem has been fully understood and a plan has finally taken its place underneath the anxiety. I thought often during those 6 weeks about every Sunday dinner over the preceding 93 days, replaying them now with the new information layered over the old memory. Glenda's comment, 2 months into the marriage, about how the apartment really should feel like everyone's home. Wade's casual mention around the same time that his mother just liked feeling involved. Tessa's borrowed salon money, which I now understood, after tracing one final disbursement through the equity line, had also quietly come from my own apartment's value, routed through Wade's credit card, and then forwarded to his sister as a loan she'd shown no intention of ever repaying. None of it had ever been about family generosity. It had been arithmetic the entire time. My labor, 11 years of it, converted into equity, then quietly redistributed to cover everyone else's shortfalls, while I sat at that table, believing I was simply being asked to be flexible about rent. I am infrastructure to this family, I thought one Sunday evening, watching Glenda refill Wade's wine glass with the same doting attention she'd never once extended to me. Not a daughter-in-law, not someone whose home deserved the same respect as the house we were currently sitting in. Something closer to a resource, useful, reliable, quietly load-bearing, and never once actually seen as a person whose ownership of anything mattered enough to ask permission for. I stopped looking for an explanation that would make any of it forgivable. Somewhere around week 4 of building that folder. There wasn't one. There had never been one. There was just $68,000 drawn against 11 years of my labor, and a family that had quietly decided I was more useful as a financial resource than valuable as a person whose name belonged on the only deed that actually mattered. Karen and I finalized the legal filings the same week, the block on future borrowing, fully recorded, a quitclaim reversal drafted and ready, contingent on Wade's signature, and divorce paperwork, prepared but not yet filed, the final piece I'd been most reluctant to actually commit to on paper, even after everything else had become undeniable. You don't have to file the divorce paperwork the same day, Karen told me, the week before the family meeting. You can present everything else first and see how he responds. I know, I said. But I already know how he'll respond. I've watched him respond to every difficult moment in our marriage by staying quiet and hoping it resolves itself without him having to choose a side. I'm not interested in watching that performance one more time. I filed the divorce paperwork 2 days before the scheduled Sunday dinner, quietly, without telling Wade, the same way Glenda had quietly opened a line of credit against an apartment that had never belonged to her. If silence and secrecy had been acceptable tools for the family to use against me, I felt no particular obligation to abandon them entirely in my own defense. The night before the dinner, I sat at my kitchen island one final time, reviewing the folder cover to cover, checking every tab, every date, every figure, the same final review I'd give any presentation before walking it into a room full of people whose job was to find the flaw I'd missed. There wasn't one. I'd built this the way I build everything professionally, assuming from the very first page that someone would eventually try to argue with it, and making sure nothing in it gave them anything to successfully argue against. I thought, sitting there in the quiet of my own kitchen, about the exact moment everything had actually started. Not the rent demand, not even the quitclaim signing, but earlier than that, the first week of marriage, when Glenda had asked, almost casually, whether Wade and I had thought about how the apartment fits into the bigger family picture. I'd brushed the question off at the time, assuming it was simply nosy curiosity rather than the opening move in a process that had clearly been planned deliberately from almost the very beginning of our marriage. If you've ever realized, looking backward, that a pattern you'd assumed was random had actually been intentional from the very first incident, drop a comment. I think that particular recalibration, rewriting your own memory of events you lived through in real time, is one of the strangest experiences a person can have. I packed the folder into my bag that night, the same navy binder, unremarkable, exactly the kind of object nobody at that dinner table would think twice about until the moment it actually opened. I didn't tell Wade what I was bringing. I didn't tell anyone except Karen, who'd be available by phone if anything in the room required immediate legal clarification. I slept better that night than I had in 6 weeks, the specific, settled rest that comes after finally finishing a project you've been carrying, unfinished, in the back of your mind for far too long. Sunday arrived exactly the way every other Sunday had. Pot roast, the good china, the same lavender scent that still clung faintly to certain corners of my own apartment despite every effort I'd made to air it out. Glenda greeted me at the door with her usual warm, performative affection, completely unaware that the woman she was hugging had spent the last 6 weeks quietly assembling the exact evidence required to dismantle everything she'd spent 93 days building. "I hope you brought your checkbook," she said lightly, ushering me toward the dining room, her tone carrying the same casual confidence she'd used delivering the original rent demand. "I brought something better," I said, and walked toward the table where my folder was about to do all the talking I'd spent 6 weeks preparing for it to do. I set the folder on the dining table before anyone had even finished sitting down. The navy cover, unremarkable, against the white tablecloth, the kind of object that drew no attention until I opened it. The same pot roast smell filled the room, the same ironed tablecloth, the same lavender hand cream lingering faintly from Glenda's hands as she'd hugged me at the door minutes earlier. Every sensory detail identical to 93 days of dinners that had led, eventually, to exactly this moment. Ray's water glass sat sweating a small ring onto the tablecloth beside his plate, untouched, the same patient stillness he always brought to these gatherings. Glenda was already reaching for the gravy boat, mid-sentence about something unrelated, when I unzipped my bag and pulled out the first document. I didn't wait for an opening in the conversation. I simply set it down, flat, square to the edge of the table, and let the silence do the work of getting everyone's attention. The room went quiet in stages, conversations trailing off one by one as people noticed something had shifted at the head of the table, Tessa's fork pausing halfway to her mouth, Wade's hand stilling on his wine glass. "Before we talk about rent," I said, "I want to talk about this. The original deed. Mara Monroe, sole owner, recorded 4 years before the wedding." Glenda glanced at it, confused, the same casual confidence from the doorway still intact, clearly assuming this was simply paperwork I'd brought to prove the apartment existed, evidence she could quickly fold into her own narrative about family property. Her eyes scanned the page quickly, the kind of cursory read someone gives a document they don't yet realize is about to matter. Then I set down the second document. The quitclaim deed, recorded 3 weeks after the wedding, my own signature on it, dated and notarized. I watched her expression shift slightly as she took in the date, the small flicker of recognition crossing her face before she caught herself and smoothed it back into composure. "This added Wade as joint owner," I said, I signed it believing it was estate planning paperwork. I didn't read it as closely as I should have. Wade's face had gone pale, the particular pallor of a man watching a conversation move somewhere he'd hoped it never would. "Mara, we can talk about this privately." "We're already talking about it," I said, my voice even, calm, the same tone I use presenting any risk assessment to a room full of people who'd rather the numbers said something different. "And everyone here should hear the rest of it too." I set down the third document. The home equity disbursement record, $68,000 drawn against my apartment 19 days after the quitclaim was recorded. $68,000, I said. $31,000 went to a credit card in Wade's name that I didn't know existed. The remainder went to Glenda's mortgage servicer. I set down the foreclosure filing beside it, the dates highlighted, the timeline unmistakable, exactly in time to stop a foreclosure that had quietly started against this house 6 months earlier. The room had gone completely silent. I watched Glenda's expression shift in stages, the same way I'd watched other family confrontations unfold in stories I'd heard secondhand over the years, except this time the family sharing my own last name was the one finally running out of explanations. Her hand had gone still on the gravy boat handle, the casual confidence from minutes earlier completely replaced by something tighter, more uncertain. If you've ever watched a confident accusation collapse the moment actual documentation enters the room, drop a comment. I think there's a specific satisfaction in watching someone's certainty evaporate exactly as fast as the evidence arrives. "That money helped this family," Glenda finally said, recovering some of her composure, though her voice had lost its earlier ease. "Family should help family. You have plenty." "I had 11 years of overnight shifts and skipped vacations," I said. "I had a down payment I saved one paycheck at a time before I ever met your son. None of that was ever plenty that belonged to anyone but me." Wade spoke next, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in 4 years of marriage. "I thought I could pay it back before you ever noticed," he said. "I didn't think it would actually hurt anything. I just needed time." His eyes wouldn't quite meet mine, fixed instead, somewhere on the edge of the folder, the same evasive stillness he'd shown at the original rent demand dinner, except now there was nowhere left for that silence to hide behind. "You didn't borrow time," I said. "You borrowed my equity without asking me, and used my own signature against me to do it." Tessa, who'd been quiet until now, suddenly found her voice, the particular defensive reflex of someone who senses the conversation might eventually point in her direction too. "This has nothing to do with me," she said, her tone sharp, almost accusatory, as though the documents on the table were somehow an attack on her personally rather than evidence of something that had already happened months earlier. I set down a fourth document. A transfer record, $4,200, routed from the same equity line through Wade's account, and forwarded 3 days later to Tessa's salon. "It has a little to do with you," I said. Tessa's face went through the same pale, chapeau recalibration. Glenda's had a moment earlier, the specific look of someone realizing a private arrangement they'd assumed was permanently invisible had just become extremely visible. She opened her mouth to respond, and then, apparently finding nothing adequate to say, closed it again. Ray, who'd been quietly examining each document as I set it down, finally spoke for the first time all evening. He picked up the deed, then the quitclaim, then the disbursement record, reading each one carefully. The same patient, unhurried attention he brought to everything, the kind of careful reading that comes from a man who's spent decades not trusting a story until he's checked it against whatever paperwork exists underneath it. "The apartment was hers before any of you touched it," he said finally, setting the documents down and looking directly at his sister. This conversation is over, Glenda. Glenda opened her mouth to argue, and then, for the first time in the 4 years I'd known her, seemed to find nothing left to say. Her hand, still resting near the gravy boat, had gone slack, the easy confidence of the entire evening completely drained out of her posture. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect triumph, the cinematic satisfaction of finally winning a room that had spent months underestimating you. That isn't quite what I felt. What I felt was closer to relief, the specific, exhausted relief of finally setting down something heavy I'd been carrying alone for 6 weeks, the particular weightlessness that comes right after a long, careful audit finally closes. I have 2 options for you, I said, looking at Wade now, the rest of the table fading slightly out of focus the way it does when you're addressing exactly one person in a room full of witnesses. You sign the apartment back into my sole ownership, take responsibility for the loan balance, and we settle this privately and quickly. Or I take everything in this folder in front of a judge, and we let the documentation speak for itself in a much more public setting. Wade looked at his mother, then at me, the same searching look I'd watched him give Glenda 100 times over 4 years of marriage, whenever a difficult decision required him to choose a side. For the first time, his mother had nothing reassuring left to offer him. Glenda stared down at the tablecloth instead, the same woman who'd spent 93 days treating my apartment like a shared family asset, now visibly unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I'll sign it," he said quietly. "Whatever you need." I didn't gloat. I didn't deliver a closing speech designed to make him feel smaller than he already did in that moment. I simply nodded, gathered the documents back into the folder, and stood up from the table, smoothing my dress with the same calm, deliberate motion I'd use closing out any difficult meeting. "Karen will send the paperwork this week," I said. "I'd appreciate everyone's cooperation in making this quick." I walked out of that dining room without looking back at any of their faces, the same way I'd walked out of countless difficult meetings at work after presenting a finding nobody in the room wanted to hear. The lavender scent followed me briefly into the hallway, the last trace of a house I had no intention of returning to. Wade signed everything within the week. Karen finalized the quitclaim reversal. The divorce moved through court with the clean efficiency that comes from a marriage with almost no shared assets left to dispute. And within 2 months, I was once again the sole and undisputed owner of the apartment I'd spent 11 years earning. I remember sitting in Karen's office the day the final paperwork came through, watching her file the last document into a folder of her own, and feeling something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since long before that final dinner. The simple, quiet confirmation that the apartment had returned, fully and finally, to exactly the ownership it had always been meant to hold. I changed the locks the same afternoon the paperwork finalized. It felt less like a dramatic gesture and more like simple, overdue maintenance, closing a vulnerability that should never have existed in the first place. I remember standing in my own doorway afterward, turning the new key in the new lock, listening to the unfamiliar click of a mechanism that had never once been touched by anyone outside the household I'd actually consented to share it with. Glenda didn't call. Wade did once, a month later, apologetic in a way that arrived too late to mean very much. I listened politely, the same professional courtesy I extend to any closed case that occasionally tries to reopen itself, and told him I wished him well, genuinely, before ending the call and not picking up again when he tried twice more over the following weeks. I don't think I was being cruel by not answering. I think I had simply finished the conversation we needed to have, and anything further would have just been him trying to feel better about something I'd already settled on my own terms. My apartment smells like fresh coffee again instead of lavender hand cream. I sit at my kitchen island most mornings now, reviewing nothing more complicated than my own calendar, the same surface where I once built a spreadsheet, thorough enough to dismantle an entire family's quiet arithmetic. I've started keeping the windows open more often than I used to, letting the last traces of that scent finally finish airing out. A small, ordinary ritual that's come to mean more to me than it probably should. I went back to flying full schedules within a month of the divorce finalizing, the same overnight routes I'd once worked to save toward a down payment that, for a brief, strange stretch of time, had nearly stopped belonging to me, without my even realizing it was slipping away. There's something almost meditative now about sitting in a galley at 35,000 feet, miles away from any dining room table, simply doing the job I've always been good at, without anyone in earshot, trying to quietly redraw the lines around what's mine. The people who truly love you never ask you to prove what already belongs to you. I keep that thought framed now, small, beside the copy of my deed I'd hung in my home office 4 years ago, the same deed that had quietly done all the talking, in the end, that I'd spent 6 weeks preparing it to do. Some mornings, I catch myself glancing at both frames side by side, the original celebration and the quiet vindication that came after, and feeling, finally, like the story between them had reached exactly the ending it was always supposed to.